The night corridor outside the nursery was meant to be sealed. Yet the door stood open by a few inches. I stopped, hand resting on the log tablet, listening. A toy soldier lay on its side, pushed farther than a child could throw. The camera feed blinked once, then resumed. Protocol said continue the round. Instinct said wait. Something in that hallway had already gone wrong.
The guard stood alone in the narrow control alcove, the low hum of the servers pressing against the silence like held breath, eyes fixed on the corridor feed running at half speed, the timestamp flickering with a hesitation that should not exist, a fraction of a second where the image smeared and corrected itself, subtle enough to escape routine review, but obvious once noticed. And he replayed it again, slower now, noting the light along the skirting board shift as if a body had passed too close to the lens, the sensor compensating late, the kind of obstruction that never made it into official briefings because it was never supposed to happen on that corridor, not outside a child's nursery, not during a sealed night rotation. And he leaned closer, aware of the temperature drop from the cooling vents, aware of his own breathing becoming measured, controlled, professional, as the figure entered frame, a senior royal, identifiable not by face but by gait and impatience, shoulders tense, steps uneven, the posture of someone accustomed to space yielding. And then the smaller shape appeared at the edge of the image, barely there, just a blur of pale fabric and movement, and in the next instant it was gone, not exiting so much as displaced, and the guard paused the feed, the room suddenly louder for the absence of motion, protocol dictating that such footage be logged as routine unless clear evidence of threat was present, protocol reminding him that proximity alone was not misconduct, that interpretation was not his mandate. Yet the toy soldier from the corridor replayed in his mind the way it had lain on its side too far from the door, the way the door itself had been ajar. And he checked the system log, fingers steady as he scrolled through entries that were precise to the second, finding the gap, the missing keystroke that should have confirmed the corridor sweep, an omission small enough to be blamed on human error, large enough to carry consequence. And he opened a new entry, the cursor blinking patiently as if waiting for him to decide what kind of man he was going to be in the next 30 seconds. The language of the form neutral, forgiving, designed to smooth irregularities into acceptable explanations, and he began to type, describing the obstruction, the brief loss of clarity, choosing words that neither accused nor absolved, documenting movement without motive, presence without intent. And when he reached the classification field, he stopped, the options arrayed in familiar order, clear, inconclusive, requires review, each carrying weight beyond the screen, each tied to unwritten expectations. And somewhere beyond the control room, a door had been closed, softly, too softly to hear, and the guard felt the pressure settle, not dramatic, not immediate, just a quiet awareness that once filed, the record would become real, immutable, and that not filing it would also be a decision, one that would never be questioned because it would never exist. He leaned back slightly, chair creaking in the otherwise controlled environment, and replayed the sequence one final time, forcing himself to watch without interpretation, without the instinct that had kept him effective for years, noting instead the measurable details, the angle of the senior royal's arm, the sudden acceleration of movement inconsistent with casual motion, the child's loss of balance indicated by the camera's auto-adjustment to motion blur, and he felt the familiar pull of protocol tightening, reminding him that senior royals were not to be scrutinized beyond necessity, that intent could not be inferred, the children stumbled, corridors echoed, cameras failed, and yet the system had not failed entirely. It had recorded enough, more than enough, to make the omission of a review dishonest. And he thought of the training room, of the instructors who had drilled into him that protection was not about confrontation, but anticipation, not about authority, but responsibility. and he returned to the console, shoulders squared, selecting Requires Review with a single deliberate click that sounded louder than it should have, the system accepting the input without comment, generating a reference number that would now trail the footage wherever it went. And he completed the entry with clinical precision, timestamp, location, personnel present, environmental notes, leaving emotion out of it because emotion did not belong in records. And when he filed the log, the confirmation banner appeared briefly before dissolving back into the interface, the moment passing without ceremony, without acknowledgement, yet the room felt altered, as if a line had been drawn across its floor. And almost immediately the internal channel chimed, a soft tone indicating a supervisory acknowledgement, no words yet, just presence, and he stood, smoothing the front of his uniform, aware that the next hours would not follow routine, that questions would come framed as clarifications, that pressure would be applied in the careful language of concern and efficiency. And as he powered down the terminal, he took one last look at the frozen frame he had paused earlier, the senior royal's profile indistinct, the child already out of view, and he understood that whatever followed would not be about what had happened in that corridor, but about how it was defined, contained, and forgotten, and that by choosing not to forget, he had placed himself inside the machinery he was trained to serve, not as a cog, but as friction, a small resistance that would now have to hold.
By the time the guard returned to the control level, the atmosphere had changed in ways too subtle to announce themselves, but too consistent to ignore. The usual low exchanges between technicians reduced to nods and brief acknowledgments. The air cooler than the upper floors, the fluorescent lighting flattening faces into expressions of practiced neutrality. And he took his position at the auxiliary console without comment, logging in under his credentials and noting that the footage he had flagged was already queued for secondary review, not erased, not escalated, simply waiting. And as the feeds populated across the monitors, he felt the presence of oversight without seeing it, an awareness that his actions had been registered, even if no one had yet spoken, and he began the task assigned, cross-referencing corridor angles, adjusting timestamps, aligning camera clocks that drifted by milliseconds but never enough to matter until they did. And there it was again, clearer now from a secondary angle, the senior royal entering frame faster than protocol permitted in residential zones, the body language sharp, compressed, and the child appearing at the periphery, smaller than before, closer to the wall, and when contact occurred it was brief, almost incidental in isolation, a shoulder turned, a hand moving without pause, but the result was measurable. The child's center of gravity disrupted, the fall ungraceful, unprotected. And the guard paused the feed, eyes scanning for context, for anything that would soften the interpretation, finding none. And he annotated the frame with time markers, not conclusions, just facts. And when the shift supervisor approached, footsteps deliberate, the guard did not turn, continuing his review as if nothing were unusual, listening as the supervisor spoke in the careful cadence reserved for internal matters, asking what he had seen, not what he thought, and the guard responded accordingly, describing motion, duration, angles, refusing to supply intent even when silence invited it. And the supervisor nodded, expression unreadable, reminding him that footage involving senior royals required discretion, that misclassification could have consequences beyond the control room, that careers had ended not through misconduct but through misunderstanding. And the guard acknowledged the statement with a neutral tone, returning to the feed, adjusting brightness to capture the moment of contact more clearly, knowing that clarity itself could be construed as provocation. And as additional angles confirmed the sequence, the silence deepened, no one interrupting, no one commenting, the control room operating as if this were any other review, and yet the absence of directive felt deliberate, a test perhaps, or an invitation to reconsider. And when the classification prompt appeared again, requesting a preliminary assessment before the footage moved further up the chain, the guard felt the weight of the room settle on him, not as pressure applied, but as expectation withheld.
He filled in the assessment fields methodically, selecting language that was precise without being inflammatory, noting physical contact resulting in loss of balance rather than assigning motive, marking the incident as exceeding standard interaction parameters without labeling it abuse, aware that every word would be parsed by those trained to read between them, and when he submitted the form, the system accepted it without delay, the entry time-stamped, immutable, and the supervisor exhaled softly, the sound barely audible but loaded with meaning, and leaned closer, lowering his voice to suggest that an inconclusive classification might protect everyone involved, that children were resilient, that moments passed, that the institution endured because it absorbed irregularities rather than amplifying them. And the guard listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on the monitor now showing an empty corridor, the scene already over, its significance growing only because it was being discussed. And he replied that the footage did not support an inconclusive finding, that the parameters were clear, that his role was to report what the system captured, not to interpret outcomes. And the supervisor straightened, the conversation ending without resolution, leaving behind a space filled with unsaid implications. And within minutes a notification appeared indicating that higher authorization had accessed the file, the silent machinery of escalation turning smoothly, impersonally. And the guard felt the first tangible resistance, not overt, not confrontational, but present in the way tasks were reassigned, in the way his access privileges flickered briefly before stabilizing, in the way colleagues avoided his gaze. And as the shift progressed, he continued his duties, responding to alerts, monitoring feeds, maintaining the appearance of routine, while understanding that the choice he had made was now being evaluated not on its accuracy, but on its compliance. And near the end of the shift, he received a formal request for clarification, scheduled, procedural, framed as support, and he acknowledged it, logging the time, preparing to restate facts he had already recorded, knowing that repetition would not weaken them, but might wear him down. And as he powered down his station, the control room lights dimming to night mode, he understood that silence was not absence here, it was strategy, and that by refusing to let the incident dissolve into it, he had positioned himself against a force that did not need to raise its voice to be felt.
The adjustment order came through just after midday, embedded within a routine escort update that would attract no attention unless one knew how to read it, a subtle reconfiguration of positions and timings justified under efficiency language. And the guard reviewed it once, then again, noting how his name had been placed at the inner flank rather than the rear, how the child's movement window had been narrowed by minutes, how proximity thresholds had been quietly rewritten, and he understood that this was not a reprimand or an endorsement, but a compromise, an attempt by the system to absorb risk without acknowledging it. And when he reported to the marble antechamber, the air carried the faint chill of conditioned stone, footsteps echoing too clearly beneath the vaulted ceiling. The child arriving moments later under the supervision of attendants who kept their voices low and their expressions fixed. And the senior royal already present, posture controlled now, movement slower, the agitation from the footage replaced by practiced calm. And as the procession began, the guard took his revised position without comment, standing closer than custom dictated, close enough to feel the disturbance in the air when the senior royal shifted direction unexpectedly, close enough to register the child's hesitation as a tightening of pace rather than a glance. And when the senior royal extended an arm, not aggressively, not overtly, but with an impatience that sought to guide rather than ask, the guard stepped laterally, a movement so smooth it barely registered as intervention, his shoulder aligning between hand and child, his presence justified by formation alone. And for a fraction of a second the corridor seemed to narrow, the space recalibrating around the new arrangement, and no words were spoken, none required, the senior royal pausing just long enough for the message to land,
eyes flicking to the guard and away again, and the child continued forward, breath audible now that the distance had closed, and the escort resumed, the sound of shoes against stone regaining its rhythm. And the guard kept his gaze forward, heart rate steady, aware that this was the moment where instinct and protocol overlapped just enough to allow action, and also the moment that would be remembered differently by everyone present. And as they moved through the palace corridors, he felt the scrutiny increase, not hostile but attentive, attendants adjusting their spacing, secondary guards recalculating sight lines, the institution responding to an unspoken shift. And when the escort concluded without incident, the guard logged the movement as completed, noting no deviations, the record accurate in its own way. And yet the tension did not dissipate, lingering in the controlled quiet that followed, waiting for acknowledgment that might never come. It came instead as a meeting request, scheduled with careful neutrality, no urgency flagged, no reason specified beyond procedural alignment. And the guard arrived on time, uniform precise, demeanor unchanged, entering a small administrative room where the walls absorbed sound and the lighting flattened detail. And across the table sat two officials whose roles were defined by function rather than personality, their questions framed to elicit confirmation rather than explanation, asking why the escort formation had altered mid-corridor, whether he perceived a threat, whether he had acted independently or under directive, and the guard answered each in turn, referencing the written adjustment order, citing proximity thresholds, describing his movement as corrective rather than reactive, language chosen to anchor his actions firmly within acceptable parameters. And when asked whether the senior royal's behavior had influenced his decision, he paused just long enough to be precise, stating that his focus remained on the child's safety and movement efficiency, that he had observed no need for escalation, only for spacing. And the officials exchanged a brief glance, the kind that carried weight precisely because it was brief, and one of them noted that such interventions could be misinterpreted, that visible barriers carried symbolic weight, that senior figures were sensitive to perceived obstruction, and the guard acknowledged this without concession, replying that formations existed to prevent misinterpretation of intent during movement, that predictability reduced risk. And the meeting concluded without resolution, without instruction to change course, leaving him with the sense that his actions had been filed under tolerated, a category as unstable as it was temporary. And in the days that followed, the new formation persisted, unchallenged but unendorsed, the child moving with greater ease, posture less guarded, the guard maintaining his position with the same restraint he brought to every duty. And when the senior royal appeared again, interactions were limited, controlled, watched, and the absence of incident began to speak for itself, a quiet validation that did not erase the past, but contained it, and the guard understood that this containment was fragile, dependent on continued vigilance and the willingness to intervene without spectacle. And as he completed his reports each evening, the weight of what he had done settled into routine, not as triumph or defiance, but as responsibility assumed, and he knew that the record he had created was still moving through channels beyond his reach, gathering significance not through noise, but through persistence, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer suffice.
The notification arrived without sound, flagged as archival rather than actionable, and the guard recognized its significance immediately, the kind of administrative movement that indicated a decision had already been made elsewhere, beyond discussion or reversal, and he accessed the system during a low-traffic window, confirming that the footage and accompanying logs had been transferred from active review servers to a protected repository with restricted overwrite permissions, a place where records were not examined often but were preserved deliberately. And the finality of that shift settled over him as he read the authorization trail,
names and departments listed without commentary, each step compliant, each signature distant. And later that afternoon, the child's schedule was amended, subtly but decisively. Movement windows shortened, residential zones reassigned, guard rotations tightened under the rationale of developmental stability. And the guard accompanied the transition in silence, observing how the child adjusted to the new quarters, smaller rooms with warmer light, fewer echoes, toys arranged deliberately rather than scattered. And he noted the way the child moved through the space with less hesitation, hands no longer clenched when doors opened, a change small enough to escape notice unless one was watching closely. And the senior royal's presence receded accordingly, not through decree, but through logistics, overlapping schedules eliminated, access narrowed under procedural language that framed separation as efficiency. And no one spoke of the footage, no one referenced the incident directly, the institution functioning as it always had, absorbing disruption through reorganization rather than confrontation. And the guard felt the strain of vigilance ease slightly, replaced by a quieter awareness that the system, once forced to acknowledge a boundary, had chosen preservation over denial. And as he completed his end-of-day report, the routine checklists and confirmations grounding him, he understood that what had been done could not be undone, not because it was dramatic or public, but because it had been properly recorded, correctly stored, and therefore immune to revision. In the weeks that followed, the palace returned to its rhythms. Tours resumed, corridors filled and emptied according to schedule, and the guard remained at his post, his role unchanged on paper but sharpened in practice, aware that the absence of incident was not evidence of resolution but of containment. And on one quiet evening he reviewed the access logs again, confirming that the archive remained untouched, its presence a constant even when unseen. And he reflected on how easily the moment in the corridor could have been reduced to a misstep, a misunderstanding, a line omitted from a report, and how that omission would have erased not only accountability but protection. And as he escorted the child through a familiar passageway, the lighting softer now, the steps unhurried, he observed a steadiness that had not been there before, a confidence that came from predictability rather than reassurance, and he adjusted his pace to match, maintaining distance without withdrawal. And there were no speeches, no acknowledgments, no gestures of gratitude exchanged, only the quiet continuation of duty. And when he later passed the corridor where it had begun, the door sealed, the camera feed uninterrupted, he paused briefly, not out of suspicion, but recognition, understanding that the institution would never mark this as a turning point, that history would not note his name or the choice he had made, but that somewhere in the layered systems of record and routine a line existed that could not be crossed again without consequence, and that was enough, not as vindication, but as assurance that the boundary held. And he resumed his patrol, footsteps steady, carrying forward the knowledge that protection, when done correctly, left no visible trace except the absence of harm.